Hello, my name is Dallas Clements. Today I'll be talking about radio communications for scouts in the field. This presentation was originally given in April of 2024 as part of the Tennessee Military Department Merit Badge University's adult track. However, I'm recording this now in April of 2025, so there are some updates in this deck. And this deck can also be used for your scouts who are working towards Radio Merit Badge to help identify where different services are on the electromagnetic spectrum. We'll talk more about that at the end of the slides. Have you ever been on a canoeing trip with your troop? You have a large troop and you've got canoes spread out across a large distance. You ever wish there was a way that you could communicate between that lead canoe and that trail canoe? Have you ever set up camp somewhere in the middle of nowhere and wish you could get a message back to a spouse or a family member, just letting them know you arrived safely, maybe what the plan is for tomorrow? But unfortunately, because where you're at, or maybe fortunately, depending on how you look at it, there's no cell service in your area. Do you ever split up as a troop? Maybe you get to a park and your older scouts who are getting ready for Philmont, they go backpacking out in the back country, while some of your younger scouts stay closer to the parking lot and do more car camping. How do you communicate between those two groups? Well, today we're talking about different radio services that are available to help you close some of those gaps. That'll be the first half of the presentation. The second half of the presentation, we'll talk about radio activities that are really tailor-made and could work very well in a scouting program to help enhance some of your outings and different activities. So let's talk about radio options. A lot of different options out there. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each. First up is the family radio service. You're probably familiar with these type of radios, whether you knew that name or not. If you went to just about any store in the United States that would sell a walkie-talkie, a Walmart, Target, Best Buy, these are the radios you're most commonly going to find. They are inexpensive. They do overlap with the next service we'll talk about, which I mark as a positive because of the interoperability. People in your troop may already have the next type of radio, and so this radio will work with the next as well. They don't require a license, and they are very inexpensive. The downsides, though, with FRS is they have low power, which means your range is going to be very limited. You may look at the package and it lists 10, 20 miles, but that's not really what you're going to experience out in the field. They say up to 20 miles on some of the packaging because that's physically possible if you have perfect line of sight from the bow of one cruise ship to the bow of another, or from mountain peak to mountain peak. If there are no obstructions between the two radios and you have not exceeded the curvature of the earth, then yeah, you could make that transmission, but that's not the environment in which most people find themselves in. So what are you going to actually find in the woods? Maybe a half mile. If you take these to a large event, you may find that the limited number of channels available are going to be a real problem. If everybody else has these radios because they are cheap and very accessible, then the spectrum may be very crowded and you may not be able to find a place for your troop to reside without stepping on somebody else. And these radios operate in the ultra high frequency space. Next up, we'll talk about General Mobile Radio Service. GMRS does have, as we mentioned before, some overlap with FRS, so these radios can be compatible with the other group. You can find these as handhelds or as mobiles that you install in your vehicle. You can even get repeaters that operate in the GMRS space. Now, why is that advantageous? We just talked about line of sight with FRS. GMRS is going to be on pretty much the same frequencies. It's going to be confined to the same line of sight restrictions. So if you want to get the range of a large area, you're going to need a repeater up at a high point, a mountaintop, or on a tower. And some communities actually have this. Allow your low power handheld to reach much farther than it would be able to alone. Now you can get GMRS radios that will transmit GPS coordinates, which could be useful for coordinating locations within your group on backpacking trips or other outings. You can also send text messages through some of these devices. Now, on the con side, because these offer generally more power and more features, they're going to be going up in price, but still fairly affordable for a scout and their family. This is a licensed service, so to remain legal, each scout family would have to purchase a license for their family. That would be $35, covering everybody in that household for 10 years. And you do get access to more frequencies in exchange for that licensure fee. These radios also operate in the UHF spectrum. I bring that up because anyone working towards radio merit badge, we'll talk about this requirement when we get to the end. So knowing where these different services reside will help them meet those requirements. CBs, or citizen band radio, is also another unlicensed service like FRS. These were much more popular in the 70s and 80s, but you'll find them still in the trucking industry because they allow truckers to talk from point to point to know what's coming up on the road in terms of wrecks or detours that they need to be aware of. There is a strong following with the overlanding and four-wheeling community, so if you have families in your troop that are also engaged in those activities, this may be a radio that they already use in their vehicles. You get a few more channels than you do with FRS and GMRS, and you get a little more power, but still we're still talking relatively low power when we get into some of the other radio services that we'll talk about in a little bit. Another downside with CBs is it tends to be a little bit of the Wild West. Language could be more of an issue on Citizens Band than on some of the other frequencies, though there's opportunities for a person to act the fool on just about any frequency. You just may see it a little more common on CBs. And if you are of a certain age, you'll recognize this photo, Smokey and the Bandit. The CBs are what they were talking on in that movie. These, unlike FRS and GMRS, are operating in the HF, the high frequency spectrum, between 26 and 27 megahertz. Next up is MERS, the multi-use radio service. These are not as common as the FRS or GMRS radios, and as a result, you're going to find the frequencies assigned to them to be even less crowded than some of the other options we've talked about. These operate in the very high frequency spectrum, which tends to propagate a little bit better in an outdoor environment, which we find most of our scouting activities. These are unlicensed like FRS and CB. They're relatively low cost, but even though I mentioned being less common as a positive, it can also be a negative because it's less common. Your families are less likely to own these radios, so they're going to have to go out and purchase them if you as a troop decide that's what you want to gravitate towards for communications. And they are limited in their power output to 2 watts, which means the range are going to be low, slightly better than FRS, slightly worse than GMRS, but you get none of the repeating capabilities that GMRS can provide. And these, as I mentioned before, are in the very high frequency, or the VHF, which is wedged in between HF and UHF. Specifically, these operate between 151 and 154 megahertz. Amateur radio service, or ham radio, as you sometimes hear it referred to, opens up a lot of doors that aren't or simply are not available with any of the services that we listed before. These offer you between short and long range, depending on what frequencies you're utilizing and the type of radios that you acquire. You get a lot more spectrum. I'll go ahead and open up that part of the slide. As you can see, the FCC devotes a lot of frequencies to the amateur radio community because the amateur radio community has a history of community service and experimentation that helps advance the art and science of radio. And as a result, they allow the amateur radio operators to have access to more frequencies with which to conduct those 2 missions. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of repeaters across the United States. And the reason that's important for us in the scouting context is you could take a very low power radio and be able to reach much further because of that repeater located on some prime real estate. And for us in radio with line of sight, prime real estate is a tall tower on a mountaintop, which could get you 100 plus miles depending on the line of sight for that particular location. That can be very useful for us as we're backpacking, or even if we're just driving to a rural area and we've long ago lost cell reception. You can use these radios to send your GPS location, to send a text message. You can even send an email through some of the amateur radios out there. Now, the negatives, it is licensed, but unlike GMRS where you just write a check, you have to take a test, a knowledge test, to get your amateur radio license. And there are different levels of amateur radio license that unlock more frequencies and more spectrum. Each one is going to take a test to achieve. Because these radios offer more features, or can offer more features, those extra features are going to cost more. So the radios are going to be more expensive, but you can get into an entry level for just about as cheaply as you can a GMRS radio. I say that to say under $50. There are a couple other features that are available in the amateur radio service that I think in the scouting context deserve a little more explanation. We talked about the repeaters. Those are available in GMRS as well. But in amateur radio, it is not uncommon to see those repeaters linked together, either by radio to radio or through an internet connection. And what that allows us to do is to cover exponentially higher or wider areas. So, for example, I'm from Tennessee. We do a lot of trips across the state. And it is possible, because of linked repeater systems like this one, MTers, to be able to talk the entire journey, regardless of whether you have cell phone coverage in the areas that you're operating in. There is a feature available on some amateur radios known as APRS, or the Automatic Packet Reporting System. And one of the interesting features of APRS is you can beacon out your location, your GPS coordinates, and your call sign on a specific frequency as you cover distance on a trail or on a road. This could be useful for the families back at home to be able to check in and see what the status of your convoy is, either going out to a camp out or backpacking trip or coming back from it. And depending on the coverage in the area, where there are APRS repeaters or not, you could even have coverage on the trails themselves. So this can be useful, again, for just keeping families back at home informed, or people within your party. If you've got multiple handhelds in your party itself, if you have to split up, then you could see the location of the other users in your group. This is a screen capture from an APRS website where I just happened to be looking at the Great Smokies, and we can see somebody has driven out to Klingman's Dome, parked, they climbed up to the dome, got back in their vehicle, and they're headed back home now. And the third advanced feature that I want to highlight under the amateur radio service is the ability to send emails over radio. There was a camp out about a year ago where we got out to a state park, long since had left cell coverage behind. All the scouts were bedded down for the night. I wanted to be able to let my spouse know that we had arrived safely, all was well. So I fired up the radio in my car, whip antenna on the back of the vehicle, $40 laptop underneath the seat, typed up a short message, sent it over the HF bands, and was picked up by a tower site in Lubbock, Texas, that then passed my traffic automatically to the internet, where my wife got an email in her box from my amateur radio call sign. So a bit of a niche there, but this is great for communication, for if you're doing any long-range trips far from civilization. You can send these types of messages out. And the person on the other side doesn't have to be an amateur radio operator. They just need an email address. Shifting gears completely, we're going to talk about a different type of radio. This is Mesh-tastic. This is something that has come about in the last few years. These tend to be very low cost, small. Most of them are fairly power efficient. They can run on a battery for a couple days. These radios rely often on a Bluetooth connection to your cell phone, whether your cell phone has service or not, just so they can use some of the advanced features like show locations of other radios on a map, or for you to more easily type up a text that you then send out through the Mesh-tastic radio. There's a lot of good videos on this. I've got a screen capture from an amateur radio guy who goes by the name Ham Radio Crash Course. He's got several videos that I would reference if you want to learn more about Mesh-tastic. As applied to scouting, this would be a lower cost way to do some of those APRS functions that we talked about without having to have an amateur radio license, because this is unlicensed spectrum at about 915 megahertz, and lower cost. We're talking about $30 to $40 for a piece of equipment that then interfaces to the cell phone that you probably already have. Though several of them can be fairly feature rich without having to have a cell phone either. By themselves, they have a fairly short range. They're very low power. However, being mesh radios, they listen for other devices on the same frequency. And if they hear another device on that frequency, they automatically repeat and pass down the line, so to speak, your position packet. So your group, let's go back to that canoeing trip where you kind of spread out over long distance on a long canoe trip. Messages being sent from your lead boat to your trail boat could be relayed by all those boats in between, depending on how many devices that you had in your group. Satellite trackers are a very interesting option for scouts who are involved in high adventure trips. I have some pictures here from when we went to the sea base a couple years ago. One of the parents in our troop had one of these and let us borrow it. There is no license associated with this. There's no test. This is just a straight up commercial service. What you see here is a picture of a Garmin InReach. This is a very popular device, though there are several other providers that offer this service. These devices can work by themselves or Bluetooth to a cell phone in order to generate your text messages or show locations on a map. What you're seeing on the picture on the left is what the families back home could see. They could see the breadcrumb trail that we were leaving as we were going around this island. You could see where we dropped anchor for the night with these red push pins. That was also a signal to the families back home that all's well, everyone's good. We're cooking for the night. We'll get underway again tomorrow morning. The downside with this particular device or service is there are monthly fees. They're going to range depending on the provider and how many messages and how much location tracking you want included in the plan. Much like a cell phone plan is going to vary what you get for it and the cost. So something you'd have to weigh in terms of the benefit to your group. However, in terms of reliability, in terms of long battery life, in terms of there's always someone listening, this is probably one of your best options. Most of these, if not all of them, are going to have an SOS button on them, a one-touch feature that beacons out your location to a dispatch center that is prepared to send help to your location if they receive an SOS from one of these devices. So something to think about for high adventure, whether that be a Philmont or Sea Base or Northern Tier. These are also usually fairly small, lightweight, energy efficient devices. This particular InReach can last 2 weeks on its internal battery. Next up, satellite phones. This is probably outside of the scope of most scouting activities. However, if you find yourself doing something high adventure plus, you're mountaineering or something like that, this might be an option you want to have, because in addition to having coverage pretty much anywhere you go, you can have voice in addition to the text functions that we just looked at with the Garmin InReach. These are going to be one of your most expensive options, though. The handset is going to run roughly equivalent of what a high-end cell phone is going to cost, so to say $1,000 plus. And your airtime is also going to be very expensive. It's going to be dollars per minute. But it's really going to vary on the provider you go with. This particular one is Iridium. They have coverage of pretty much the entire globe, over 80 satellites linked together. There are other providers, if you're going overseas, that may only focus on a specific continent, may only have 1 or 2 satellites, and the cost is going to vary depending on the amount of coverage they have. These operate in the ultra high frequency. And the last radio option we're going to talk about is really a game changer in this field. When we first did this presentation last year, really the only game in town for a cellular device operating over satellite were the Apple iPhones and the later model Apple iPhones, or I should say the newer model ones. And at the time, you could only do emergency SOS. But at this point, Apple has opened it up where they can do normal text messaging between devices. So this is something that some of your scouts and some of your parents could be using right now. We don't know at what point Apple's going to start charging for this, but as of the time of this video, it is still free to be able to send text messages via satellite when you've gone beyond the range of local cell phone towers. The other big change that's happened in the last few months is T-Mobile has created a partnership with Starlink so that their devices can send text messages too, regardless whether they're iPhones or not. Right now, it's only open to newer cell phones, ones that have been type certified by the FCC to communicate via satellite. And originally this was going to be just for T-Mobile users, but here in the last few weeks, they've opened up the beta to users on other carriers like Verizon and AT&T. What they have announced is after they get out of the beta period, I think around July, this is going to become a paid service, both for the T-Mobile users who are currently on board. It will be rolled into the higher tier plans. And if you have a lower tier plan, you could pay a monthly fee, kind of like with that Garmin InReach, to have it as an add-on. But also, you could pay T-Mobile to tag it on above and beyond what you're currently paying your Verizon or your AT&T or other type carrier. So another interesting option. Now, something I'd caution you on, though, is we often talk about a PACE plan, a primary, an alternate, a contingency, and emergency. And you may already have a cell phone on your person on a trip. And so this seems like a very tempting option. It could be a very tempting option as a primary, but especially if you're talking high adventure and you're far removed from help, and if something goes wrong, you want to be assured that the message is going to get through. I would argue that if you're using your cell phone as a digital map and as a camera and as other features, you may not have the battery you need when you really need it. So a dedicated device like a Garmin InReach could still be a good option for you. Just something to think about. These also operate on the higher end of the ultra high frequency. Now we're shifting gears. We've talked about different radio services, and now we're going to talk about different activities that you can do with radio in a scouting context. First up is Jamboree on the Air, otherwise known as JOTA. This is a large activity that happens worldwide and enables scouts across the globe to talk to each other, primarily through amateur radio. However, there is another component of JOTA called JODI, or Jamboree on the Internet, which allows communications between troops that don't really have an amateur radio connection, and they just communicate via FaceTimes and Zooms and team calls and that sort of stuff to have a pen pal international camaraderie type effect. But JOTA and JODI take place on the third full weekend of October every year. Parks on the Air is an interesting opportunity that's very popular in amateur radio and could very easily be added on to a camping trip with scouts. The idea here is every state or national park in the United States or around the world has a unique identifier. And if you take a radio to that site, you can activate that site. And other people are trying to add all those locations, all those sites to their logbook. So you are helping to activate that particular park for the time that you're running your station. People are trying to get that park into their logbook, and you can rack up contacts very easily. It can be a great novelty to your scouts to be on the air and have dozens of people from different states and countries trying to get their attention and make a contact with them so that they can check that park off of their list. It's called POTA, Parks on the Air. Very popular in amateur radio. Very similar to POTA, something called SOTA, Summits on the Air. Same idea as POTA, except the only places that are recognized to be activated are mountain peaks and summits. There's a list of these on their website. You can see if there's one in an area that you like to backpack in now, and you could take some lightweight, high frequency radio equipment in the amateur radio service and activate that site. SCOTA, very similar to POTA and SOTA, except now we're activating scout camps. So every scout camp in at least the United States, if not the world at this point, is going to have a unique identifier. This presentation was originally given to adults in the Middle Tennessee Council, so I've listed the identifiers for the scout camps in the Middle Tennessee Council. But if you go to the website, you can find the scout camps for your council. It's not just the scout camps that get identifiers. Your troop can use an identifier so that they can be added into other people's logbook, and you can add them into yours. Field day, another amateur radio activity. This is going to be one of the most popular amateur radio activities and offers a lot of opportunities for scouts to visit and participate. This happens every fourth full weekend in June. If there is a club in your area, and for just about everybody in the United States, at least within commuting distance, there should be a club. You can find the nearest club that's participating at arrl.org. That's the Amateur Radio Relay League.org. What do you find at a field day? Well, you're going to see a lot of amateur radio operators preparing for an emergency to operate in an austere environment, often, under tents in a field, outdoors in a field environment. They're going to have stations set up that they'll be using, but they'll also invite you to use. They, in fact, get extra points if they get unlicensed individuals to try out getting on the air under the authority of their license. This could be a great way to make contacts for future radio merit badge instructors. If you have scouts who want to get their license, a lot of these clubs will offer licensure classes. So this would be a good place to meet those folks and to build those relationships for future scouting activities together. It would not be unusual at one of these field day events to see a demonstration of radio direction finding. This is something that if your scouts like geocaching or orienteering, this is going to probably be popular with them as well. In radio direction finding, or fox hunting as it's sometimes called, a transmitter is set up hidden outside somewhere, and your scouts would use radios and directional antennas to try and find that transmitter. This does have a practical real-world effect. If ever in your community there was a malfunctioning device that was unintentionally jamming, say, police or fire frequencies, then your local community leadership might call on amateur radio operators to use these skills to help them find the location of this errant station and help them shut it down. But for just the enjoyment of being outside and using radio outdoors, radio direction finding could be an activity for one of your scout meetings. Again, making connections with the hams or the amateur radio operators during a field day or finding points of contact on arrl.org could help you set up one of these activities. And to our final slide, there's radio merit badge. So radio direction finding is actually an activity that you can use to complete some of the requirements for radio merit badge. You can also visit broadcasting stations, or your scout can be involved in shortwave radio listening, which is something we haven't really talked about on here because we focused on things that will transmit. Shortwave listening is just using a receiver to pick up those high frequency or shortwave stations that exist around the world. The last way that you can get radio merit badge is to really do a deep dive on amateur radio. So something to think about as you talk to those hams. But as I promised, all that frequency data that was at the bottom of each of these slides can help your scout if they're working on their radio merit badge. Requirement 3 alpha requires them to draw a chart of the electromagnetic spectrum covering between 300 kilohertz or 0.3 megahertz all the way to 3000 megahertz. And that's essentially what we had at the bottom of each of our slides. They just have to label it accordingly. And then on that chart, they have to locate at least 8 different radio services. I've given you 5 so far. so it would not be hard with the Radio Merit Badge pamphlet to find others like AM radio, FM radio, television broadcast, or law enforcement, public safety radio services. And then finally, if you want to learn more about Radio Merit Badge or find resources for teaching Radio Merit Badge, I would highly recommend the website k2bsa.net. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to field them in the comments below and get back to you as soon as I can. Well, this has been Dallas Clements, K7DCC. Thank you for your time.